"Don't touch that glass," Rebecca whispered, though by then it was already sealed inside a clear evidence bag on the table between us. I was still wearing my wedding dress, an ivory silk gown with pearl buttons at the wrists, and somewhere beyond the closed door, 70 guests were laughing beneath strings of warm lights as if nothing unusual had happened. My new husband, Thomas, believed I was taking a quiet moment to fix my makeup. My brother, Richard, believed I had finally taken a sip from the drink he had been watching all evening. Only 3 people knew the truth: Rebecca, my attorney, Hannah, the Vineyard's event manager, and me. I sat in a small office behind the reception hall, listening to the muffled music through the wall. The room smelled faintly of coffee, printer paper, and the lavender from my bouquet. On the desk beside the sealed glass rested a folded copy of Richard's speech. He had left it near the microphone during dinner, confident that no one would read it before he stood up. Rebecca had skimmed it while Hannah secured the drink. "Are you ready to let him know?" she asked. I looked through the narrow window in the office door. Richard stood near the dance floor in a charcoal suit, one hand in his pocket, smiling as he spoke to our cousin Daniel. He appeared relaxed, almost cheerful. Every few seconds, his eyes moved toward the empty chair at my table. He was waiting for something. Confusion, perhaps. A public mistake. Any small moment he could later describe as proof that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I folded my hands in my lap. They were steady. That surprised me, although it should not have. At 68, I had learned that fear did not always announce itself through trembling or tears. Sometimes it sharpened the room around you. I could see every detail clearly. The scratch on Rebecca's leather briefcase, the pale lipstick mark on the safe replacement glass Hannah had brought me, the tiny fleck of gold thread on the hem of my dress. "Not yet," I said. "I want to hear his speech first." Rebecca studied me for a moment. She had represented my family for 11 years and knew Richard well enough to understand why. I needed him to finish what he had started. For months, he had been telling relatives that I was forgetful, fragile, too easily influenced. He called his comments concern, but concern does not arrive with legal questions about removing a trustee. Concern does not send emails asking whether an embarrassing public incident could be used to challenge a woman's judgment. Concern does not spend a wedding reception watching a sister's glass instead of celebrating her happiness. 18 days earlier, I had still been trying to excuse him. I told myself Richard was protective because we had already lost our parents, and because my first husband had been gone for 8 years. I told myself he worried that Thomas had entered my life too quickly, even though Thomas and I had known each other since high school and reconnected only after years of friendship. I told myself family could say cruel things while believing they were helping. Then my daughter, Claire, received an email that was never meant for her. Richard had addressed it to an attorney with the same last name. Claire opened it before noticing the mistake. By the time she called me, her voice was so quiet I knew the message was worse than an insult. Richard was not trying to protect me from Thomas. He was trying to build a version of me that a court might believe. A woman who forgot appointments. A woman who became confused in public. A woman who needed her younger brother to make decisions for her. I read the email twice at my kitchen table. Then I washed my coffee cup, dried it, placed it in the cabinet, and called Rebecca. That was the morning I stopped treating Richard like my brother and started treating him like a legal risk. Now, less than 20 yards away, he lifted his champagne glass and tapped a spoon against it. The music faded. Conversation softened. Someone called my name from the ballroom, telling the bride it was time for her brother's toast. Rebecca reached for the evidence bag, but I stood first and smoothed the front of my dress. Richard thought the evening was moving according to his plan. He had no idea that every important decision had already been made before I walked down the aisle. I opened the office door and heard his warm, practiced voice fill the room. "I'd like to say a few words about my sister Margaret," he began. I smiled and returned to my seat, ready to let him say every one of them. Richard began with a childhood story that made several guests smile. He described the summer I taught him to swim at Lake Briar when he was 9 and terrified of water deeper than his knees. According to him, I had held out my hands and promised I would not let him sink. The memory was true, but he told it as if it proved something about me now, as if the sister who once protected him had become someone who needed to be protected from herself. I watched him from beside Thomas, my fingers resting lightly on the stem of my glass. Richard had always been skilled at wrapping control in the language of concern. Even as a boy, he preferred rules that placed him at the center. When our mother became ill, I drove her to appointments, cooked her meals, and organized the bills. Richard arrived on Sundays with flowers and opinions. He told me which doctor she should see, how our living room should be arranged, and what foods I should prepare, then left before the dishes were washed. After our father died, that pattern hardened. The family trust included the house near Lake Briar, 140 acres of wooded land, and several modest investments our parents had built over a lifetime. Father named me trustee. Richard never challenged the decision publicly, but the disappointment lived behind every polite smile. He said the responsibility was too heavy for me. He suggested we manage everything together. When I reminded him that Father had made his wishes clear, Richard laughed and said our father came from another generation. What he meant was that a decision he disliked should not count. For years, I tried to preserve peace. I sent him quarterly reports even though the trust did not require it. I included him in meetings with the property manager. I asked his opinion about repairs, leases, and taxes. Every courtesy became evidence, in his mind, that he belonged in the decision. Every disagreement became proof that I was emotional. When Thomas returned to my life, Richard changed. At first, the shift was small. He asked whether I was sleeping well. He repeated questions I had already answered, then looked concerned when I noticed. At family dinners, he would say, "Margaret, we discussed this last week, even when we had not." If I corrected him, he smiled at the others as though patience were required. Claire noticed before I did. She told me he was creating moments that made ordinary differences sound like confusion. I defended him. "He is your uncle," I said. "He worries too much, but his intentions are good." Claire did not argue. She only asked me to start saving his messages. Then came the comments about Thomas. Richard suggested that a widower who had reconnected with an old friend might be lonely enough to mistake companionship for love. He asked whether Thomas knew the value of the lake property. He warned me that marriage could complicate estate planning, although Rebecca had already prepared a clear agreement protecting both families. When I told Richard that the documents were complete, his face became still. Not angry, calculating. 2 days later, he called Claire and asked whether I had recently forgotten any appointments. He told her he was gathering information because he wanted to help. Claire asked what kind of help required gathering evidence without speaking to me. Richard ended the call. From the microphone, his voice drew me back to the reception. He was praising my kindness now, telling the room that I had spent my life caring for everyone else. Guests nodded. Thomas covered my hand with his. Richard paused, looked directly at me, and softened his expression. Then he said that love sometimes required families to recognize when a strong person was beginning to struggle. The room became quieter. He had finally reached the reason for his speech. I did not look away. For most of my life, Richard had mistaken my willingness to keep peace for permission to define me. That evening, surrounded by everyone he hoped to influence, I decided to let him discover the difference. Richard let the silence settle before continuing. He spoke gently, almost tenderly, which made his words more dangerous. He told our guests that I had always been independent, but that independence could sometimes prevent a person from recognizing when she needed help. A few relatives shifted in their chairs. Others looked down at their plates. Thomas remained beside me, his hand warm over mine, but I could feel the question moving through the room. What had Richard told them before tonight? I already knew part of the answer. His campaign had begun months earlier with details so small that each one seemed harmless on its own. At a Sunday dinner in May, he asked whether I remembered ordering a new refrigerator. I said I had never ordered one. He laughed and told everyone I must have forgotten the conversation. 2 days later, Claire found the sales estimate in Richard's email, not mine. He had requested it without asking me, then used my refusal as evidence that my memory was failing. In June, he called Thomas and said I had missed a medical appointment. I had not missed anything. The clinic had rescheduled it, and Richard knew, because I had forwarded the notice to the family group. When Thomas corrected him, Richard sighed and said, "That is what Margaret believes." Those words stayed with me. He was no longer disagreeing with me. He was teaching people to distrust anything I said. At our 4th of July cookout, he moved my car keys from the kitchen counter to a drawer near the laundry room. I searched for 10 minutes while he watched from the patio. When I finally found them, he announced that I had placed them there and forgotten. Claire had seen him enter the laundry room moments earlier, but she did not confront him. She took me aside and told me exactly what she had witnessed. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Perhaps he had moved them for safekeeping. Perhaps he had forgotten doing it. Even then, I was still working harder to protect Richard's character than he was working to protect mine. The following week, he began calling relatives without including me. He asked whether they had noticed changes in my behavior. He used careful phrases. Losing track of details. Becoming overwhelmed. Making sudden decisions. He never said I was incapable. He only offered enough suggestions for others to reach that conclusion themselves. Then he would repeat their concern back to me as if it had appeared naturally. "Cousin Daniel is worried about you," he said one afternoon. "Aunt Louise thinks this wedding is moving too quickly." When I called them directly, both sounded confused. Daniel had merely asked whether I needed help arranging transportation for guests. Louise had said she hoped Thomas and I would be happy. Richard had turned kindness into testimony. Claire began saving everything. She printed messages, recorded dates, and placed copies in a blue folder she kept in her home office. At first, I told her she was overreacting. She answered with a question. Why does every misunderstanding make him look responsible and make you look confused? I had no answer. A pattern is difficult to see while you are standing inside it. You notice one missing key, one altered story, one concerned telephone call. You explain each incident separately because accepting the larger truth would mean admitting that someone you love has been studying your trust and using it against you. From the microphone, Richard said families sometimes had to make painful decisions before a crisis occurred. He looked toward Claire, perhaps expecting support. She met his eyes without smiling. I remembered the evening she had placed the blue folder on my kitchen table. It held 11 incidents from 4 months, each documented with dates, messages, and witnesses. She rested her palm on the cover and spoke quietly. "He is not worried about you, Mom. He is rehearsing a case against you." That was the first moment I understood that Richard did not need me to lose control. He only needed enough people to believe that I might. Richard continued speaking, but my mind returned to the morning Claire showed me the message that changed everything. It was 18 days before the wedding, just after 8 o'clock. I was standing at my kitchen counter arranging white roses in a glass pitcher when my telephone rang. Claire did not greet me. She asked whether I was alone. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I told her Thomas had gone to pick up lumber for a repair at the lake house. She said she was coming over and asked me not to call Richard. 20 minutes later, she entered through the back door carrying her laptop and the blue folder. She placed both on the kitchen table, removed her coat, and sat without accepting the coffee I offered. That frightened me more than tears would have. Claire had always believed a difficult conversation was easier with something warm between your hands. She opened the laptop and turned it toward me. The message had arrived shortly before sunrise. Richard had intended to send it to an attorney named Claire Whitman, but his telephone had selected my daughter's address instead. The subject line referred to trustee replacement options. The language inside was polite, careful, and unmistakable. Richard asked whether a public incident showing confusion, poor judgment, or emotional instability could support a petition to remove me as trustee. He mentioned my upcoming wedding as an opportunity to observe my behavior around relatives. He also asked what kind of witness statements would be useful if family members believed I was being influenced by a new spouse. I read every sentence twice. The kitchen clock clicked behind me. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly along the road, then disappeared. Ordinary sounds continued, while the last excuse I had made for my brother quietly collapsed. Claire watched my face. "He is planning something at the wedding," she said. I closed the laptop and carried my untouched coffee to the sink. My hands did not shake. I rinsed the cup, dried it with the blue towel beside the stove, and returned it to the cabinet. I needed the small routine because it reminded me that the room was still mine, the morning was still mine, and Richard had not taken my ability to decide what happened next.
"Do not answer him," I said.
Claire looked surprised. "He will realize he sent it to me." "Not immediately. Let him believe the message is sitting unread." I called Rebecca from the kitchen telephone. She arrived before noon with a legal pad, a portable scanner, and the calm expression she used when bad news required clear thinking. She read the email, examined the messages in Claire's folder, and asked questions without offering comfort too soon. Had Richard requested access to trust records?
Yes.
Had he spoken to doctors or financial advisors without my permission? He had tried. Had anyone heard him describe me as confused? At least 6 relatives. Rebecca wrote each answer in neat black ink. Then she looked across the table at me. "Suspicion is not enough," she said. "But this message gives us a direction. Do not confront him. Do not change your behavior around him. Most importantly, do not allow him to create the incident he is asking about." Claire leaned forward. "Then we cancel his invitation." I shook my head. Removing Richard would protect the wedding, but it would also warn him. He would delete messages, revise his story, and claim that Thomas had separated me from my family. Richard had spent months building a false picture of me. I needed him to believe the picture was working. Rebecca warned me that patience would be uncomfortable. I told her discomfort was different from helplessness. Before she left, she made digital copies of everything and asked Claire to preserve the original email exactly as it had arrived. I stood at the window and watched Rebecca's car turn onto the county road. The roses on the counter had begun to open, their petals bright against the morning light. For 64 years, I had thought of Richard first as my little brother, even when he behaved like an adversary. That morning, I understood the order had to change. Love could explain my sadness. It could not determine my strategy. From that moment forward, I would not measure his actions by the brother I remembered. I would measure them by the risk he had chosen to become. For the next 18 days, I gave Richard exactly what he expected. I answered his calls. I thanked him for offering to help. I even asked whether he would give a toast at the reception, knowing he would hear the invitation as proof that I still trusted him. His voice brightened immediately. He said he would be honored. After we ended the call, I wrote the date and time in the notebook Rebecca had given me. pretending not to see a trap required more discipline than confronting it, but Rebecca had been clear. Richard believed he was directing the story. We needed him to continue until his intentions could no longer be dismissed as concern. The following morning, Rebecca met Thomas and me at her office in Charlottesville. She reviewed our estate documents, the family trust, and the agreement protecting the property each of us had brought into the marriage. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Rebecca explained what Richard had been asking another attorney, he became very still. He did not demand that I cancel the wedding or remove my brother from the guest list. He only asked what I wanted. That question reminded me why I trusted him. Richard spoke about protecting me while making decisions behind my back. Thomas protected me by leaving the decision in my hands. I told them the wedding would continue as planned. Rebecca then prepared an amendment removing Richard from every future role connected to the trust. He had been named as a possible successor years earlier, when I still believed responsibility might soften his need for control. That assumption had expired. The amendment named Claire and a professional trust company instead. I signed it in front of witnesses 3 days before the ceremony, but we did not file the final notices immediately. Rebecca wanted Richard to believe nothing had changed. We also transferred original deeds, tax records, account statements, and insurance documents from the locked cabinet in my home to Rebecca's secure storage. Richard had never possessed a key, but he knew where the records were kept. I stopped using shared family passwords and changed the access information on every account related to the lake property. The property manager received written instructions that no information was to be released without my approval. Each change was quiet. No dramatic telephone calls.
No accusations.
Just one door closing after another. Hannah became involved 6 days before the wedding. She called while I was reviewing the seating chart and asked whether Richard was responsible for arranging my drinks during the reception. I told her he was not. She explained that he had contacted the vineyard twice. He wanted the servers to keep a particular beverage at my place throughout the evening. He also asked where the security cameras were located and whether recordings were kept after private events. Hannah said the questions had sounded unusual, especially because he described himself as my caretaker. I had never used that word. I asked her not to return his call until she spoke with Rebecca. That afternoon, the 4 of us met in the empty reception hall. Sunlight came through the tall windows and stretched across the oak floor where Thomas and I would have our first dance. Hannah showed us the cameras covering the entrance, bar, and dining area. Rebecca asked that the system remain unchanged and that all recordings from the wedding be preserved. Hannah agreed to assign one experience server to my table. Any unattended glass would be removed and replaced without discussion. No one would confront Richard unless there was an immediate need. Claire offered to stay near me all evening, but I told her to enjoy the wedding. I did not want my daughter spending the day watching her uncle instead of celebrating with her mother. She agreed, although reluctantly, and promised only to keep her telephone close. On the night before the ceremony, Richard stopped by the vineyard during rehearsal. He hugged me in front of everyone and said he was relieved I had finally allowed the family to help. I thanked him. Then he glanced toward the bar and asked whether I had chosen my drink for the toast. I said Hannah was handling everything. For 1 second, his smile tightened. Then it returned. I watched him walk away and understood that he still believed I was the only person in the room who did not know what he was planning. That belief was the final advantage I intended to give him. The wedding morning arrived beneath a clear October sky, with red maple leaves scattered across the vineyard road and a cool breeze moving through the rows of vines. I woke before sunrise and sat beside the bedroom window at the inn, watching the hills slowly take shape in the pale light. For the first time in 18 days, I allowed myself to think only about Thomas. He had waited 8 years to ask me to dinner after we met again at a high school reunion, and another 2 years before asking me to marry him. Nothing about us had been rushed. Nothing about him had ever required me to surrender my judgment. Claire arrived at 8 o'clock carrying coffee, a garment bag, and the pearl earrings my first husband had given me on our 25th anniversary. She asked whether wearing them felt right. I told her love did not erase what came before it. It simply made room for what came next. By noon, the vineyard glowed beneath strings of small lights and branches of autumn greenery. White roses lined the aisle. Wooden chairs faced an arbor overlooking the hills. Guests gathered in coats and shawls, their voices soft beneath the music. Richard arrived early. He wore a charcoal suit and carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed every detail was moving in his favor. He kissed my cheek, complimented my dress, and asked whether I had eaten enough that morning. The question sounded caring to anyone nearby. I heard the calculation beneath it. I thanked him and walked away. Thomas waited for me under the arbor. When I reached him, his eyes filled with the quiet warmth that had made me trust him from the beginning. During our vows, I forgot Richard was there. I forgot the legal documents, the cameras, and the blue folder in Rebecca's briefcase. Thomas promised to respect the life I had built before him and to stand beside me without standing in front of me. I promised the same. When the ceremony ended, our guests applauded, and for several minutes the day belonged entirely to us. The reception began inside the oak hall. Sunlight came through the tall windows, touching the tables dressed in cream linen and copper-colored leaves. Hannah greeted me near the entrance and gave a small nod. The cameras were recording. The assigned server was in place. Rebecca sat near the back, appearing to be nothing more than an old family friend enjoying the celebration. Richard moved easily among the guests. He shook hands, offered compliments, and watched me whenever he thought I would not notice. During photographs, he asked twice whether I needed something to drink. I said the staff had taken care of me. His smile remained, but the muscles along his jaw tightened. When dinner was served, a fresh glass appeared at my place. I took one sip while Richard watched from the next table. It was safe. Hannah had opened it in front of the server and carried it directly to me. After the main course, guests began moving toward the dance floor and dessert table. I stepped away to speak with Aunt Louise near the windows. From there, I could see the bar reflected in a large antique mirror behind her. Richard approached my table carrying a folded napkin. He looked toward the dance floor, then toward the hall entrance. He reached for my glass and held one hand above it for only a moment. The gesture was small. Anyone watching directly might have missed it. The mirror did not. Neither did Hannah. She crossed the room calmly, lifted the glass with a tray, and replaced it before Richard had taken 5 steps. He turned once and saw me standing beside Aunt Louise. I smiled as though nothing had happened. His shoulders relaxed. Moments later, Thomas offered his hand for our first dance. We moved beneath the warm lights while the band played an old song we both remembered from high school. Richard stood near the edge of the floor, checking his watch. He expected confusion. He expected embarrassment. He expected the room to turn toward me for all the wrong reasons. Instead, I followed Thomas across the polished oak floor without missing a step. When the music ended, Richard was no longer smiling. Then Hannah approached me quietly and said the glass had been secured. I thanked her, returned to my table, and watched my brother reach for the microphone. Richard tapped the microphone twice and waited until the room became quiet. He began with the story about Lake Briar, telling our guests how I had taught him to swim when he was 9. His voice was warm, and for a moment, he sounded like the brother I had spent years trying to remember. People smiled when he described me standing waist-deep in the water with my arms extended, promising I would not let him sink. Then his tone changed. He said I had always been the strong, One, the person everyone depended on, but even strong people eventually reached a point when they needed others to make difficult decisions for them. Thomas placed his hand over mine. Across the room, Claire sat completely still. Richard continued. He told our guests that during the past year, I had become forgetful and easily overwhelmed. He mentioned missed appointments that had never been missed, misplaced keys he had moved himself, and conversations he had invented. Each example sounded harmless when separated from the others. Together, they formed the false portrait he had been building for months. I watched several relatives exchange uncertain glances. Richard saw them too, and confidence returned to his face. He said my marriage to Thomas had happened quickly, despite knowing we had spent 2 years building our relationship. He said major financial decisions should not be made during periods of emotional change. He never mentioned the trust directly, but he did not need to. Everyone in the family knew about the lake property. Everyone knew Father had placed it under my care. Richard looked toward Thomas and thanked him for being willing to support me through the challenges ahead. The insult was delivered so politely that a few guests almost applauded. Thomas did not react. He had promised me that Richard would be allowed to finish, and Thomas understood that keeping a promise sometimes required more strength than defending someone too soon. Richard then turned toward Claire. He said my daughter had also noticed changes, and that the family would soon need to discuss how responsibilities should be shared. Claire's chair moved softly against the floor as she stood. Richard smiled, assuming she intended to support him. Instead, she raised her telephone and said, "Please continue, Uncle Richard. I want to make sure I record your exact words." The room became so quiet that I could hear the small fountain outside the open patio doors. Richard's smile weakened. He asked why she was recording a family toast. Claire answered that he had described private medical concerns, financial responsibility, and my supposed inability to make decisions in front of more than 70 witnesses. She said accuracy mattered. Richard laughed, but the sound came too quickly. He claimed Claire was misunderstanding him. Then he looked at me and said this was exactly the kind of emotional reaction he had been worried about. I remained seated. "No one is reacting emotionally," I said. "You are the only person who seems uncomfortable." A few guests turned toward Rebecca, near the back of the room. She had not moved, but her briefcase rested beside her chair, and Richard recognized it. He knew she rarely attended family gatherings without a reason. He lowered the microphone and asked whether I had invited my attorney to my wedding. I told him Rebecca had been my friend for 11 years and had every right to celebrate with us. That answer did not calm him. He began speaking faster. He insisted he had only wanted to protect me. He said someone had to think about the future because I refused to recognize my limitations. Then he made the mistake Rebecca had been waiting for. He said that after tonight, the family would have enough information to take the necessary legal steps, whether I agreed or not. The words settled over the room. No one moved. Richard seemed to hear them only after they had left his mouth. He tried to correct himself, but Claire asked what legal steps he meant. Aunt Louise asked why a wedding toast had become a discussion about removing my authority. Cousin Daniel said Richard had called him weeks earlier asking whether I seemed confused. One question led to another, and the concern Richard had carefully planted began turning back toward him. I lifted my safe glass and waited until he looked at me. "Thank you, Richard," I said. That was exactly the speech my attorney needed. For the first time that evening, Richard had nothing prepared to say. His hand tightened around the microphone, but the confidence had left his face. Rebecca rose from her chair and walked toward the front of the room with the calm precision she brought into every difficult meeting. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of anything in front of the guests. She simply asked Hannah to join us in the small office behind the reception hall. Richard looked toward the doors as if considering whether to leave, But Claire was still recording, and too many relatives were watching. Refusing would have created another question he could not answer. He placed the microphone on the table and followed us. Thomas came with me. Rebecca carried her briefcase. Hannah entered last and closed the door. The music resumed outside at a lower volume, guided by the bandleader, and the celebration continued without us. Inside the office, the sealed glass remained on the desk beneath the bright overhead light. Richard noticed it immediately. His face changed, but only for a second. Then he looked at Hannah and demanded to know why one of the wedding drinks had been placed in a bag. Hannah answered that the glass had been removed after she observed unusual contact near my table. She said the security system had preserved the entire sequence from more than one angle. Richard laughed and claimed he had only adjusted the napkin beside it. Rebecca opened her briefcase and placed a printed notice on the desk. She told him the recording would be preserved, along with the glass, his emails, his calls to the vineyard, and the statements he had made during the toast. She did not describe what the glass might contain. She did not speculate. Facts were enough. Richard turned to me. He said I was humiliating him over a misunderstanding. I looked at the man who had spent months trying to make ordinary moments look like evidence against me. A misunderstanding happens once, I said. You built this one carefully. He insisted that everything he had done was for my protection. Rebecca slid a second document across the desk. It was the amendment I had signed 3 days earlier. Richard read the first page, then the second. His eyes stopped at the section removing him as successor trustee and eliminating every advisory role he had expected to inherit. He looked up sharply and said Father had intended him to remain involved. I reminded him that Father had named me trustee because he trusted my judgment. The trust allowed me to appoint a qualified successor, and I had done exactly that. Claire would serve with a professional trust company. Richard no longer had access to records, property decisions, or future distributions beyond the specific terms already established for him. He stared at the pages as if they had appeared through some trick. You changed this before tonight, he said. Yes. That single word unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Until then, he believed the evening had been a contest over whether I would retain control. He finally understood that he had lost that contest before arriving at the vineyard. The evidence from the reception was not needed to save my position. It was needed to document what he had attempted after his position was already gone. Rebecca placed a final envelope beside the amendment. It contained formal instructions that all communication about the trust must go through her office. It also required him to preserve every message, email, recording, and document connected to his efforts to challenge me. Richard asked whether I planned to take further legal action. Rebecca answered that the preserved evidence would be reviewed and handled through the proper channels. She gave no threat and no promise. The uncertainty was his to carry. He looked at Thomas and accused him of turning me against my family. Thomas did not defend himself. He only said, Margaret made every decision in this room. Richard looked at Claire next, but she met his eyes without apology. Finally, he faced me. For a moment, I saw the younger brother who had once reached for my hands in the lake. Then the image disappeared beneath the choices he had made. You should leave through the side entrance, I said. The guests do not need another scene. He asked whether I was throwing him out of my wedding. No, I said. I am protecting what remains of it. Hannah opened the side door. Richard picked up the documents and walked into the cool evening without another word. When the door closed, Rebecca asked whether I needed a moment. I looked toward the ballroom, where Thomas and I still had a cake to cut and a life to begin. I have already given him enough of my evening, I said. When Thomas and I returned to the ballroom, the band was playing softly and the candles on the tables had burned an inch lower. Most of our guests understood that something serious had happened, but no one pressed me for an explanation. Aunt Louise touched my arm as I passed and said only that the cake was waiting. I appreciated her restraint more than any apology she could have offered. Thomas and I cut the first slice together. Claire laughed when frosting touched my glove, and the sound loosened something in the room. Conversations resumed. Chairs moved closer. The evening slowly returned to what it had been meant to celebrate. I did not mention Richard again. When the final song ended, Thomas and I stood beneath the vineyard lights while our friends waved goodbye. The October air was cool, and the hills beyond the parking lot had disappeared into darkness. I felt tired, but not defeated. Richard had tried to turn my wedding into proof that I could not manage my own life. Instead, he had given more than 70 people a clear view of how carefully he had tried to manage it for me. The next morning, I woke in the inn beside Thomas and listened to rain tapping against the window. My dress hung from the wardrobe door, still carrying the faint scent of roses. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Thomas asked whether I regretted allowing Richard to attend. I considered the question before answering. I regretted what my brother had chosen to become. I did not regret seeing him clearly. By 10 o'clock, Rebecca had sent formal notices through certified delivery and electronic service. Richard was informed that he could no longer contact the property manager, request trust records, or represent himself as acting on my behalf. The vineyard preserved its recordings. Claire preserved the email and her telephone recording. Hannah completed a written statement describing Richard's calls and his behavior near my table. Everything moved through proper channels, quietly and carefully. There were no public arguments and no dramatic announcements. Richard called me 7 times that day. I did not answer. He left messages saying the family could resolve the matter privately, which was an interesting request from a man who had used my wedding guests as witnesses. Rebecca instructed me to save the messages and direct all communication to her office. I followed her advice. Over the next 2 weeks, relatives began contacting me. Daniel apologized for believing Richard's questions had been harmless. Louise admitted that he had called her twice and suggested Thomas was pressuring me to change the trust. Some offered excuses for not warning me sooner. Others simply said they were sorry. I accepted the apologies without pretending they erased what had happened. Trust does not return because someone feels embarrassed. It returns through consistent choices, and some relationships would need time to prove they deserved another chance. Richard sent one handwritten letter. He reminded me that we were the only 2 people left who remembered our parents' house before the additions, the old dock at Lake Briar, and the summer I taught him to swim. I read the letter at my kitchen table, then placed it in the blue folder. Shared memories explained why losing him hurt. They did not require me to reopen the door. 1 month after the wedding, Thomas and I drove to the lake house. The trees were nearly bare, and the water looked silver beneath the November sky. For years, I had treated the property as something to preserve because my father had trusted me with it. That afternoon, I understood preservation did not have to mean keeping everything unchanged. Thomas and I walked through the rooms with Claire and Rebecca, measuring walls and discussing repairs. We decided to convert the house into a small retreat for older women rebuilding their lives after loss, family estrangement, or major change. The first floor would have 3 private bedrooms, a shared kitchen, and a sunroom facing the lake. The old storage building would become a workshop space. We planned walking paths through the nearest 10 acres and kept the rest of the land protected. In spring, the first guests would arrive for a quiet weekend without charge. Standing on the porch, I remembered Richard watching my glass and waiting for me to become the woman he had described.
Confused.
Dependent. Easy to control. He had mistaken silence for blindness and patience for surrender.
The
truth was simpler. I had noticed everything. I had simply chosen the exact moment to stop him.